In the flat white heat of a Kansas afternoon, three railroad men stacked near 100 tar-black bridge timbers into a pile they had been paid to burn. A woman in a faded work shirt crossed the cinders toward them. Her sleeves rolled past the elbow, her boots scuffed pale, and she stopped to count the pile a second time. She offered the foreman $9 and a week of her own hauling for every last timber, and he laughed before he tore off her receipt. He believed he had cheated a woman who could not tell good oak from firewood, and he handed her the paper, still smiling. What he could not see was the small brown book riding in her breast pocket, its corners worn soft from 4 years of secret arithmetic. That evening, at a lamplit kitchen table, her father read her column of figures twice and asked only one question: where does the water go? Down the section road, a hardware man had already promised the whole county she would be digging those timbers back out of the ground within 4 years. She held the number he had given her, the way a person holds a thing she means to test, and drove her heavy load home at the pace of a walk. On a Thursday afternoon in June of 1881, Adaline Colvard stood in a weed lot at the edge of the rail yard and watched three men stack bridge timbers they were being paid to burn. There were near 100 of them, sawn oak the color of old iron, under a skin of dried tar, hauled out of a trestle the line had replaced that spring. She counted the pile twice while the men worked, her lips moving without sound, and when she had a number for she liked, she walked across the cinders in her scuffed tan boots and offered $9 and a week of her own, hauling for the whole of it. The foreman was a lean man named Ansel Kerr, and he had a work order folded into his shirt and a box of matches in his vest, and he looked at the woman standing in front of him in a faded brown work shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow, as if she had wandered up off the section road to ask which way the depot lay. He looked at her a good while. Her hair was tied back low, dark honey gone dull with dust, and her hands hung easy at her sides, and she did not fill the silence the way most people filled it. "You understand these are pulled timber," he told her. "Company's paying us to be shut of them. The spike holes are chewed, the plates cut seats in the top faces. Nobody drives these. Nobody buys these. I'll want a receipt," she said, and that was the whole of the bargaining. He tore a leaf off the back of the work order, wrote $9, bridge oaks sold as is, and signed it against the wheel of the wagon, and she folded it once and slid it into the breast pocket of the shirt where a small memorandum book with a brown cloth cover already lived, its corners gone soft as flannel from 4 years of riding there. The tar came off that pile in the June heat with an opinion to it, sharp and black, and faintly sweet underneath, the smell of a thing that had been steeped in oil and iron so long that nothing living could get a purchase on it. Ansel Kerr believed he had made $9 off a woman who did not know timber from cordwood, and he was pleasant about it, the way a man can afford to be pleasant when he thinks he has the better end of a trade. He would not think about the exchange again for years, and when he finally did, it would be because half the county was talking about the woman he'd sold his trash to. But this story does not start with the timbers. It starts with a hedge that held in the spring of 1868. Adaline was 16 the year. The sky came apart over the Colvard place. A storm walked up the open ground southwest of Courland on a green afternoon and took the roof clean off the horse shed and threw a full stock tank 200 yards into a stand of sorghum. The barn lost the whole north wall, but the double row of Osage orange her grandfather had set out along the west line in 1857, gnarled and thorned, and half the trees leaning like old men, stood into that wind and did not break. And behind the hedge, the curing shed did not lose a single board. Her father walked her out there the next morning through wet grass, and he did not say anything clever. He crouched by one of those twisted trunks and put his flat hand against the bark, and he said the thing he would say to her 100 times across the next 40 years. Look at what had already survived. That was the whole sermon. She kept it, the way a person keeps a coin from a year that mattered, and it would still be in her hand at the very end of this account, worn smooth from carrying. Adaline Colvard was 29 years old that June, and she farmed 320 acres of wheat and grass, 11 miles southwest of Courland in Tolliver County, deeded to her father Amos Colvard, and worked by the two of them with a hired man at harvest. The financial position is worth stating plainly because everything that follows turns on it. The ground was paid for. There were $410 in a tin box in the pantry behind the flour. A team of mules, a spring wagon, 61 mother cows on grass, and $9 still owed on a used grain drill. They were not poor and they were not easy. They were the exact kind of solvent where a single bad season costs a family two good ones. An open country that far into Kansas produced bad seasons on a schedule a person could very nearly mark on a calendar. Warm air came up out of the south and met dry air coming down off the high plains, and the sky organized itself into something with a turning in it. And the Colvards had lost two barns to that turning already, one in 1,859 and one in 1,874, and they had never once had a proper cellar to climb into. The house sat on a low stone footing with a root hole under the kitchen, barely big enough for two, and when a black wall came up out of the southwest, Amos and his daughter went down into that hole and pulled a plank door over themselves and waded it out with the dirt an inch from their faces. They had priced a proper one. A stone and lime, storm cellar dug and set, had been quoted at $220, that spring by a mason out of Dunmore. Set that number against the 410 in the pantry, and you understand why the answer had always been next year. Amos Colvard was 61 that summer, thick through the chest, stooped a little, now at the shoulders, his iron gray hair combed flat to one side and worn thin at the crown. He wore small oval spectacles low on a broad weathered nose, and he carried a brass folding rule in his breast pocket, the way another man carries a watch, and he used it without ceremony on gate posts and calf hips and wagon ruts, unfolding it in sections with his thumb and reading the number to himself before he offered a word on anything. He was slow, he was careful. He had come through the hard year of 1,860 and the grasshopper summer of 1,874. Without borrowing a dollar he could not cover, and he was not a man who got up in the morning looking to be surprised. He also had no earthly idea what his daughter had been doing for the last 4 years. Since 1877, Adaline had been working her way through the load tables in an engineer's pocketbook, a fat little volume of timber strengths and beam formulas that she had borrowed on a reader's card from the subscription library in Courland, reduced so many times that the woman at the desk, a spinster named Hetty Combs, who kept the register in a fine slanting hand, had stopped writing her name on the card and simply nodded her through. Allowable fiber stress in bending, modulus of elasticity, horizontal shear along the grain, compression across the grain, which is the number that governs a beam resting on a bearing, and which nearly everyone who has ever stacked timber gets wrong. She could not afford to keep the book, so she copied the tables out by hand onto ruled paper by lamplight, the figures coming down her page in a small square print, and she kept the paper folded into the brown book, and the brown book stayed in her breast pocket, and no one in that house knew any of it lived there. It was not a secret she kept out of shame. It was a secret she kept because a thing half-finished, spoken aloud, becomes a thing other people get to have opinions about, and she meant to have her answer whole before she let anyone weigh it. There had been a teacher, too, one term of general instruction at a district academy back in 1869, and a man named Professor Merritt, who used to rap his knuckles on the lectern to wake the back row. Wood is magnificent in compression, he told them once, and a liar in shear. Load it end to end, and it will hold you up forever. Ask it to resist a sideways slip along its own grain, and it will split on you the day you turn your back. That one sentence was the reason the drawings in the brown book looked the way they looked. She had been 16 at the hedge and 17 in that classroom, and both of those years had gone into her the way water goes into dry ground, without any show on the surface, and stayed down where the roots could reach them. Now, the honest reason those bridge timbers were free. Not charity, not luck, not a foreman feeling generous on a hot day. The line had built a new steel and pile trestle across the wash north of the yard and pulled the old timber structure entire, and pulled timber like that had almost no market because the fence trade in Tolliver County wanted round posts a man could sharpen and drive with a maul behind a team. These were sawn square, 9 inches by 11, 10 feet long, and every one of them ran better than 200 pounds. You cannot drive that. You cannot sharpen that. A crosscut saw gums and dulls on the tar in about 4 passes and wants filing again. So the railroad paid a crew by the day to stack the old timber in a lot and put a match to it. And everyone involved called that disposal, and everyone involved was right about the fence posts and wrong about every other thing that mattered. A bridge timber is not a log. It is white oak or bur oak, sawn to a true square and squared again, and then it goes under load and stays under load, and the tar and the years drive the oil deep into the outer wood where it sits in the cell walls and does not come out. Fungus cannot eat it. Insects will not touch it. Water cannot get in to start the slow rot because the pore space is already spoken for. And then that timber carries loaded ore cars and cattle trains across a wash for 30 years, through freeze and drought and gumbo mud and the flat white glare of a Kansas July. And when the line finally pulls it, the line pulls it because the fastenings have worked loose and the seats where the plates rode have cut down into the top face, not because the wood failed. The wood almost never fails. The iron that holds the wood fails, and the timber underneath the failed iron is still carrying every pound it was cut to carry. And most people who look at a stack of black timber in a weed lot see a burn pile. Amos Colvard's daughter saw a beam that had already passed a 30-year proof test that nobody had to pay a dime to run. She backed the spring wagon to the pile that first afternoon and learned in the space of one timber that 200 pounds is a thing a person handles with a plank and a lever and her hip, not her back and her good intentions. By the fourth timber, she had the trick of it, walking each one up a skid plank with a peavey she'd carried along, rolling more than lifting, letting the wood do the work of its own weight. 6 of them crossed on the bed, and the mule team leaned into the collars, and the leaf springs went from arch to flat to a hair past flat, and the wagon settled onto the ground with a sound like a door easing shut. She chained the load down over the bolsters and pulled out onto the section road, heading southwest at the pace of a walk, because a heavy load hurried is a load lost, and a wheel run hot is a fellow cracked, and she was not in the business of trading a good afternoon for a broke wheel. 2 miles of red dirt, a rattling cattle guard, the mailbox with the bent flag her father had never straightened. But this story does not start with a wagon riding low on a county road either. It starts with a question almost nobody in Tolliver County thought to ask, which is why a railroad would pay good wages to burn something it had once paid good money to build and had trusted with a train. That evening, she laid it out on the kitchen table under the lamp. Not the drawings first, the numbers first, because her father read the world in numbers, and she meant to speak to him in his own tongue. Timbers, $9. Feed and hauling for the team over the days it would take, call it 4. A new file and a spare saw, $2 and change. A hand auger and bits, $1.50. Iron drift pins from the forge in town, cut to length, near $4. Washed gravel for the footing, hauled, $2. Tar, paper, and lime for the joints, better than $1. She wrote it all down the left of the page in her square hand and drew a line and set the sum at the bottom, $18 and change. And under that, she wrote one more line and underlined it twice. Mason's quote, stone cellar, same inside room, $220. Amos came in from the lot, with his sleeves pushed up and washed to the wrist at the basin, and he sat down and settled the small spectacles low on his nose and took a long while before he said anything at all. He read the column the way he read a cattle check, top to bottom once, and then again, and he took the brass rule out of his breast pocket and used its edge to hold his place on the page as if it were a straight edge laid under a survey line. "Where does the water go?" he said. It was not the first question most men would have asked, and that was exactly why she had spent 4 years reading, because she had known he would ask the right one. She turned the page to the drawing and put her finger on the low corner. Gravel bed under the whole floor. A run of clay drain tile out the low side, daylighted down the slope so it runs to open air and never backs up. He grunted low, turned to the drawing of the wall. Timbers laid flat and stacked in courses like stone, each course pinned down into the one below with iron. That tar keeps the rot off. How long? 30 years it's already done it, she said. That's what it's done, not what I'm hoping it does. He looked at that drawing another minute, the lamp, throwing his shadow big, and stooped on the wall behind him, and then he folded the brass rule closed in 3 soft clicks and put it away, and did not say yes, and did not say no. He took 3 days, and in those 3 days she did not ask him for a single hour. She fed cattle in the gray of the morning. She pulled the float out of the stock tank and reseated the leather where it had gone hard and leaking. She wrote in the brown book every night by the lamp, with the elastic working loose out of her hair by 9 o'clock. And every evening near dusk her father walked the west pasture alone, hands clasped at the small of his back, spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, stopping here and there along the fence line where the ground fell away toward the draw. He was not looking at grass. He was looking at where a person would put a hole if a person had decided a hole had to go somewhere. On the 3rd night, he came in and hung his hat on the peg and stood in the kitchen doorway with the dark behind him. "You can use the ground east of the equipment shed," he said. "Nothing comes out of the tin box. And if you cut into that pile careless and drop one of those on your foot, that's a bone, not a bruise, and we've no money for a doctor to set it wrong. One sentence of permission, one condition, one warning, and that was how a thing got decided in that house." Then he sat down and ate his supper, and did not mention it again that night or the next. What he did not say, and what she understood anyway, was that a man does not walk a pasture 3 evenings running over a thing he means to refuse. The walking had been his way of building the cellar in his own head before he let her build it in his ground. The rest of the timbers came home over 9 days, 6 to the load, because 6 was what the springs would carry without the bed kissing the axle, and she learned that limit the hard way on the 2nd load when the wagon groaned, in a way she did not like on a downgrade, and she stopped and pulled one off and left it in the ditch to fetch later. Leave in the dark before 6. 11 miles down and 11 back. Chain drive, unchain, roll them off, stack them, go again. By 9 in the morning, the tar was coming off the pile, so thick it sat on the back of her throat and stayed there through supper. Her forearms went black to the elbow and did not scrub clean, and the brown shirt took a stain it never lost, and she found she did not care about either one. By the 4th day, the yard stacks chest high and 40 feet long, laid in cross courses so the air could move through and dry it. Every square black face turned true to the one beside it, and from the section road, it looked like a thing that belonged to a railroad. And it looked, if a person did not know better, like a woman had lost her wits in a very orderly fashion. That was when the driving started. Neighbors have a particular speed for this kind of curiosity. Not stopping, which would oblige a person to say something to your face. Just slow. Just slow enough to count the stack and carry the number to the next kitchen. A widower named Emery Tate came past twice in one afternoon on his flatbed wagon, and on the 2nd pass, he was down to a walk with the ends of the reins loose in his hands, and Adaline was standing atop the stack with a cant hook, and she lifted 2 fingers off the hook, and he lifted 2 fingers off the reins, and that was the entire visit. By the end of the week, the phrase had made it to the counter of the mercantile in Cortland, and it had a shape to it. The timber woman, they were saying, the way you'd say it about a body who collected broken clocks. Word travels on flat ground, the way water does, without hurry and without any obstacle, and it gets into every low place there is. For a little while, it all seemed to be going along fine. She had the ground, and she had her father's leave, and she had a stack of proven oak, and a plan she had been filling in for 4 years, and nobody had said a hard word to her face. That did not last past the morning she needed iron. She wanted half-inch round stock from the forge, cut into 2-foot drift pins, and iron in Tolliver County came through the hardware counter at the front of Cyrus Pelham's store, because Pelham bought it by the keg from the rolling mill, and the local smith bought his there too. So on a hot Thursday, she walked in off the plank sidewalk and stood at the counter while Pelham finished with a man buying nails, and then she told him what she wanted and, when he asked, what it was for. Cyrus Pelham was 54 years old, and he had stood behind that counter for 19 of them, which in his own estimation amounted to a kind of schooling, and he had a way of leaning on his elbows with his chin lifted and his spectacles pushed up that let a person know he had heard the question before and had not thought much of it the first time. The silence held about 2 seconds. Then it got away from him. It started as a snort down the nose, And then he had to take the spectacles off and lean back off his elbows and laugh up at the pressed tin ceiling for a good while, wiping the lens on his shirt tail as he came down out of it. It was not a cruel laugh, and it is only fair to say so, because there was no meanness in it. Only 19 years of leaning on a counter and hearing 400 bad notions and building a reflex against everyone. Now what in the world, he said, settling the spectacles back onto his nose. You know what those things are, don't you? They're what's left after the good timber's used up. The railroad's not selling those, they're burning those. And there's a reason a man burns a thing instead of selling it. He set both hands flat on the counter. You're going to bury rotten trestle timber in the dirt and call it a cellar and put your daddy's people down inside it when the weather comes. Does Amos know you're at this? Because I'd hate to think a careful man spent 40 years building a place up just to watch it go to a woodpile. He said it with a smile, and the smile was the worst of it, because a person can hide real contempt behind a friendly mouth and half believe he is only being kind. Adaline did not raise her voice. She did not raise anything. 9 by 11 in sections, she said, not a 4 by 4, and laid flat. That's 99 square inches of bearing under every timber. White oak across the grain holds near 800 pounds to the square inch on the safe side of the table, and the tar isn't damaged. It's what's keeping the water out, which is the whole reason the line got 30 years under a coal train off timber that finally quit at the spike holes and never once quit in the body of the wood. I'm pinning every second course with half-inch iron on 2-foot centers, staggered and backfilling in 6-inch lifts. The load runs down the face of the wall into the footing. The pins are only there to keep any one course from walking. Somewhere around the 800 pounds to the square inch, Cyrus Pelham had stopped smiling. He rang up the iron without another word, for a moment his mouth working on something he did not say. 220 feet of half-inch, she told him, cut to 2-foot lengths. She counted the coins out flat on the wood and laid her hand on the edge of the cash drawer before he could close it. One more thing, she said. I'll want a receipt. He tore it off the pad and slid it across, and as she turned to go, he found his feet again the way men like that always find them, right at the door. When the customer's back is the safest thing in the world to talk to. 4 years, he said to that back. You'll be pulling those out of the ground inside of 4 years, and you'll pay a man to haul them off, and it'll cost you more than the $9 you paid for the pile. He wiped the spectacles one more time, pleased with the arithmetic. Adaline folded the receipt into the brown book and put the book in her pocket and walked out into the white heat without giving him the answer he was fishing for. 4 years. That was the number he had handed her, and she wrote it down in the brown book on the ride home. Not because it stung, though it did, but because a number is a thing a person can test, and a man who gives you a number has given you a way to prove him wrong on the day of your own choosing. She held the mules to a walk and let the number ride along beside her the whole 11 miles. First light the next morning, she had the equipment shed doors open to the east, and she sat on an upturned bucket running a file through the teeth of the crosscut. One direction, 10 strokes to a tooth, 30 degrees off the flat, her sleeves shoved up, and her hair tied back low and her pale gray eyes doing the thing they always did, which was measure. Before a single timber moved from the yard stack, the whole of the work already existed on one page of the brown book, and the arithmetic on that page was plain, and it was honest, and it did not flatter her. The digging came first, and it came on borrowed iron. Emery Tate loaned her a Fresno scraper and a team's worth of harness for 2 days against her fixing the sagging gate on his corral, which she did in 40 minutes with a drift pin and a length of chain and no complaint. He stood watching her set the pin, and he said, not looking at her, that his late wife would have liked the look of a woman fixing her own gate, and that was the longest string of words Emery Tate had put together in the Colvard yard, and neither of them made anything of it. She cut into the south slope east of the shed, where the ground fell away on its own, because water is a lazy animal and will always take the easiest road you offer it. And she meant to offer it a road that ran away from her walls and not toward them. 10 feet by 14, 7 feet down, the corners squared true with her father's vast brace rule, which he had handed across the supper table without a word and never once asked to have back. Then 8 inches of clean washed gravel across the whole floor, raked level and tamped with the flat of a maul, because the ground a wall stands on decides more than the wall does, and a wall set on soft footing is only a slower way of falling down. Then the timbers. She laid them flat, the 11-inch face down, and the wide face taking the bearing, in courses, and every course she broke joint with the one beneath it by 3 feet at the least. The way a mason breaks bond in a stone wall, because a stack of joints all lined up in a column is a hinge that has not yet been told what it is. Through each timber, 2 holes bored with the hand auger, sweat running off her chin onto the wood, and down through the holes the iron pins driven into the course below. So the wall knit itself together from top to bottom, instead of merely sitting there in a pile and trusting to its own weight and good weather. Here is the thing she understood that most of the county did not. A retaining wall is not in a fight with the dirt. Dirt is heavy, but dirt behaves. Dirt pushes sideways in a shape a person can predict. A wedge, harder at the bottom than the top, and you can carry that load down through staggered timber into a gravel footing and out into the ground beneath, without so much as raising your pulse, and the numbers to do it had been sitting in a load table since before she was born. Water is the enemy. Water gets in behind a wall and does not push like dirt at all. It pushes like a fluid, even and hard all the way up the height of it, and it does not care in the least how well you stacked anything. She knew that. She had read it in the pocketbook and underlined it. Knowing a thing off a page and building against it in wet ground turned out to be two different animals, and she would learn the difference the hard way before the summer was out, though she did not know it yet. Standing in the cool of that pit in the early morning, with the auger in her hand and the smell of turned earth around her, feeling for the first time in a long while something close to shore. Cutting the timber to length was the misery in it. The tar dulled the saw like nothing else she had ever put an edge to, not because the wood was hard, but because the oil carried grit the oak had drunk in over its 30 years, and every foot of cut loaded the teeth with black gum that smoked faintly off the blade. She filed after every third timber, 10 strokes to a tooth 30 degrees, and she wore leather gloves gone stiff and black, and a rag tied over her nose and mouth in 94-degree heat. And she always stood on the upwind side of a cut, because the tar smoke would blister the inside of a person's nose and sit in the throat for 2 days after. She had learned that too, the way she learned most things, once and thoroughly. Word of the digging reached town before. The walls were 3 courses up. A boy who had ridden out with a message from the mercantile stood at the lip of the pit with his mouth open and rode back with a description. And by the weekend, there was a version going around that Amos Colvard's daughter had dug herself a grave and was lining it with railroad wood. And folks laughed at that, in the easy way people laugh at a thing they have decided not to understand. Emery Tate did not laugh. He came by once more, stood at the edge with his thumbs in his suspenders, and looked down at the course's breaking joint, and the pins standing up out of the timber waiting for the next lift. And he chewed on that a while and said, "Lo," that it looked like a thing that meant to stay put. Coming from Emery Tate, who did not spend words he could keep, that was a considerable speech. By the second week of July, she had the walls up to 5 courses, 35 inches dead plumb on the rule, and she stood in the bottom of that hole one evening, with the light going long and gold across the yard above her, and felt something she was not much in the habit of feeling, which was pleased. The gravel drained. The courses stood true. Her father had come down to the lip twice, hands clasped behind him, spectacles low, and said nothing either time. And from Amos Colvard, nothing was very nearly applause. She climbed out at dusk with the file in her pocket and looked back down at the squared black courses catching the last of the light, and she let herself believe, for one evening, that the hardest of it was behind her. She was measuring the 5th course for the 6th, when Cyrus Pelham's number came back to her, unbidden, and she found she could stand it now, standing over her own true plum work with the smell of gravel and cut oak around her. Let him keep his 4 years, she thought. She took the elastic out of her hair and shook it loose and tied it again, and she climbed the last skid plank up into the yard, and she stood a moment looking at the west line, where her grandfather's Osage orange still leaned into 40 years of prevailing wind and had not yet given the weather the satisfaction. Then she banked the day's file work in the shed and went into a cold supper her father had left covered on the back of the stove, and she ate it standing at the window, watching the light die out over ground that had, for the length of one good evening, done exactly what she'd asked of it. The rain came in on a Thursday night and stayed through Saturday, 4.5 inches in 36 hours, the kind of slow-soaking rain that does not run off the way a hard storm's rain runs off, but goes straight down into the ground and stands there. Adaline lay awake the second night listening to it drum on the shingles and did not think a hard thought about it, because rain was rain and her floor drained and her footing was sound. And a person who has built a thing right sleeps easy in weather. She was wrong about that, and the wrongness was already at work in the dark east of the equipment shed while she slept, patient and even and without any malice at all, which is the only way ground ever moves against you. The clay behind her east wall took that water and held it. Tolliver County clay does a thing that sand never does. Dry, it is very nearly a brick, and a person can stand on it and dig it in clean, sharp faces and believe it will keep whatever shape she gives it. Wet past a certain point, it stops behaving like a solid altogether and starts behaving like something poured, and it leans on whatever stands in its way, and it leans hardest at the bottom with something near 60 pounds for every square foot, for every foot of depth, and it never once gets tired of leaning. She had backfilled her own excavated clay straight against the timber, tamped it in 6-inch lifts exactly as she'd told Pelham she would, and been proud of how tight she'd packed it. What she had actually built without once seeing it was a basin with a wooden side, and the July rain was filling the basin, and there was nowhere for the water to go because she had given the wall a drain at its foot and never once given the water a road out through the body of the wall where it was gathering. No weep gaps, no column of loose rock behind the face to break the pressure and carry it down. She had drawn the thing to shed water at the bottom and thought that would be enough. And the middle of the wall, where the water was quietly stacking up its weight, she had left to fend for itself. Sunday morning the sun came up hard and clean, and steam lifted off the section road in ropes, and she walked down to the pit after chores with the brass rule in her hand, easy, expecting to find her work sitting the way she'd left it. The east wall was not plumb anymore. She stood at the lip a moment before she let herself understand what she was looking at, because the mind resists a thing it has spent a summer being sure could not happen. Then she went down the skid plank and held the rule against the fourth course, and the top of the wall stood proud of its base by 2 full inches, a slow smooth bow through the center of the run, like a shelf of books, sagging under a weight the builder never reckoned on. No crack, no split, nothing broken, nothing snapped, no timber failed. That was the worst of it, honestly, worse than a clean break would have been, because a break she could have pointed at and named. This was the wall doing precisely what the water told it to do while she was not paying attention, obeying a law she had read about and underlined and then built as though it would make an exception for her. She put her flat hand against the cold, heavy timber the way her father put his hand to things, and she felt no give in the single course, no rot, no softness, the oak as sound under her palm as the day the line pulled it. The wood was innocent. She stood there a while with her hand on it and her jaw set, and then she climbed back up into the sun and took the brown book out of her breast pocket and wrote one line across the top of a clean page and stopped the work. Cold. She did not touch another timber that day. She fed and watered and reset the tank float that had gone bad again. And she moved through the chores like a woman with a stone in her boot. And every time she passed the pit, she did not look at it, because she had not yet decided whether she was going to fix it or fill it in. And she was not a person who let her hands start moving before her head had settled the question. It was near 11 that night, the yard lamp on its pole not reaching that far, when she went back down. She carried a lantern in her left hand and a 2-foot level in her right, and the beam kept finding the same ugly thing. The bow in the east wall, the whole line of it walked out toward her slow and patient, gathered worst around the fifth course where the pin spacing widened by a few inches and the wall had found its weakest place the way water finds the low corner of a field. She set the level against the timber as if the answer might have changed since morning. It had not. The bubble sat stubborn off the line, and the clay under her boots squelched and gave with every shift of her weight. And the honey-dark hair she'd tied back that morning had come half down and stuck to her neck in the wet heat that never quite left the low ground after a rain. She was 29 years old. She had $9 of railroad oak and a whole summer of daylight sunk into a hole in the ground. And for about 20 minutes down in that pit, she gave real and honest thought to filling it in. Not dramatically. Nobody was there to hear, and she was not a woman who performed a feeling she did not have an audience for. She simply did the arithmetic the way she did everything, standing in the mud with the lantern hissing. Backfill the pit with the same clay that had beaten her. Drag the timbers up to the fence line one at a time. Sell the sound ones for stock pens at $1 apiece to men who'd never ask what she'd meant to do with them. Take the loss, which was mostly a summer and not much money, and go back to running cattle and keeping her mouth shut and never again giving Cyrus Pelham the pleasure of being proved right in public. He would hear it at the counter by Thursday. He would lean on his elbows with his chin lifted and tell it to whoever was buying nails that a woman who could not tell timber from firewood had gone and buried her father's good name in a wet hole that 4 years had been a generous guess. He'd been generous. She had not made it 4 months. She stood in the wet dark with the lantern raised to the bow, and here is what stopped her hand before it reached for the shovel. She understood, all at once, and with a cold clarity that felt almost like relief, that she was not looking at a wall that had failed her. She was looking at a wall that had told her exactly what was wrong with it, in the only language a wall has, which is to move. And a 2-inch bow in a private hole on a private farm was a small, quiet noise. A thing she could kneel down and read at her leisure with a lantern. That same failure, hidden inside a finished cellar, under 12 tons of soaked earth, in the dark, in a storm, with her father and whatever neighbor's family had run to her door, sitting on a bench along that wall, would not be a small noise at all. A wall that moves where no one is watching is a warning. A wall that moves with a family against it is a grief. And the only difference between the two is whether you were humble enough to go looking before it counted. That was the thought that put her back down on her knees in the mud, with the brown book out of her pocket, its pages gone soft with damp, writing by the light of the lantern set on a timber beside her. The timbers did not fail. That was the first honest line she wrote, and writing it steadied her, because it was true, and the truth was a floor she could stand on. What had failed was every single thing she had not thought hard enough about, which came down to one thing, which was water. She wrote it out the way her father read a ledger, plainly, refusing herself any comfort. She had cut her pit into clay, and clay wet past its limit does not push on a wall. In one place, it pushes everywhere at once, and worst at the bottom, and she had packed that same clay back against the timber and called it a tight job and congratulated herself on the tamping. She had made a basin and set a wall for one wall of it. The rain had filled the basin. The clay had gone to soup. The soup had leaned on 12 courses of oak with nothing to lean back against, and the wall had done the only honest thing left to it, which was bow at the point of least restraint. She wrote 3 words at the foot of the page and drew a hard line under them. No drainage relief. The fix took her 4 days of thinking and 14 of work, and the thinking was the dear part, because the work was only a matter of hands once the head had drawn it true. First, relief. 60 feet of 4-inch clay tile laid in a trench at the level of the footing, running out to daylight at the low corner of the hog lot, so any water that reached the back of that wall had a road to travel that was not through it. Second, and this was the piece she had missed, entirely the first time at Chimney, she would never again pack raw clay against the timber. Against the back of the wall she would build a vertical column of washed river rock, 1.5 feet thick from the footing clear up to grade, a free draining path straight down to the tile, because water that strikes loose washed rock does not gather and lean and build, it simply falls, and a wall behind loose rock never feels the weight that a wall behind clay feels. Third, and this was the piece that turned a patched wall into a permanent one, dead men. Every 6 feet along the run, she would drive a timber back into the undisturbed bank at a right angle to the wall, 9 feet of oak keyed into the face course and pinned through with iron, buried in ground that had never been dug, and so had never lost its strength. A wall standing by itself is only a stack that has not fallen yet. A wall tied back into the earth behind it stops being a wall and becomes a part of the hill, and a hill does not bow. She wrote the new figures under the old ones and did not flinch at the total. The extra iron for the dead men and the tie-ins, the tile hauled from the works at Dunmore, the washed rock brought in 2 wagon loads, feed for the borrowed team through the trenching. It came to a little better than $60 on top of what she'd already spent, and $60 against 410 in the tin box was a real wound. But she had promised her father that nothing came out of that box, and she meant to keep the whole thing on the money the work itself would earn, which meant the work had to survive long enough to earn it, which brought her right back to the trench. She read the total twice and closed the book. Then she took the east wall down to the 4th course by hand, alone, in the last of August, while her father was cutting the wheat stubble for winter grazing. 28 timbers pulled and rolled up out of the pit, each one better than 200 pounds of wet oak, because she had told him she did not need help, and she was not going to be a woman who said a thing and then went back on it inside a season. Amos knew, of course. He knew the way, he knew everything on that place by walking it. He came down to the lip on the second evening of the teardown, spectacles low, hands at the small of his back, and looked a long time at the timbers she had pulled and stacked to one side, and the 4 courses she had left standing true, and he did not ask her what had gone wrong, because he had already read it in the trench she'd opened for the tile. Water found the back of it, he said, not a question. She wiped her face with the back of a black forearm. It did. I built it a way in and never built it a way out. He nodded once, slow, and worked something over behind his teeth, and then he said, the thing she would carry the rest of her life, said it easy, not as comfort, but as fact. A wall that moves 2 inches in your own dooryard is the cheapest teacher you will ever hire. He turned and walked back up toward the house in the failing light, and he did not offer to help, and she did not want him to, and that was its own kind of respect passing between them in the dusk. She rebuilt it in 14 days, plumb, pinned tight, the dead men keyed 9 feet into the bank, the rock chimney laid up loose behind the face as each course went in. The tile bedded true and sloped 1 inch in 8 feet so the water would move even when it did not much want to. She worked in the cool of the mornings and rested through the worst of the afternoon heat under the shed and went back at it in the evening, and her hands, already hard, went harder, and the brown book filled with small square figures at the head of every day. When the last course was set and the last pin driven, she did the part nobody ever watches and nobody ever thanks you for. She had painted the head of every pin with a dab of white lead as she drove it, so that a person standing on the ground with a light could see at a glance whether any single one had backed out a hair, and every Sunday evening for 8 weeks, she went down with the level and the lantern and took a reading at 4 marked points along that wall, and she wrote the reading in the book against the date, 4 columns of numbers that never once moved off the line. The second week of the readings, the rain came again, 3.5 inches in a single night, harder than the storm that had beaten her, and she lay awake for it, on purpose this time, and in the gray of the morning, she went down with the lantern before she'd even had her coffee. The chimney was doing its work. Water stood in the tile trench at the low corner and ran clear out the daylight end in a steady rope onto the grass, and the rock behind the wall was wet clear through and carrying nothing but its own weight, and the level read dead true at all 4 marks. She stood in the bottom of the pit in the wet dawn, with the water running away from her walls exactly as she'd drawn it, and she did not smile, because she was not much of a smiler, but something in her chest let go of a grip it had held since the Sunday of the bow. She had asked the ground a question and gotten a different, and this time the answer was the one she'd built for. The roof went on before the hard weather. She salvaged the frame timbers from the same trestle stack, laid a run of the shorter oak across the top of the walls as joists on 18-inch centers, decked it over with 2-inch plank, and mounded the whole thing with a foot of tamped earth crowned to shed water, with the entry cut into the high south end and a heavy plank door hung to swing outward against a stop, because a door that opens out cannot be pinned shut by debris piled against it, the way an inward door can be sealed by a fallen limb. She set stone steps down into it, 6 of them, and a hand line of rope along the wall, and a shelf at the back for a lantern and a jug and a tin of hard crackers. And when it was done, she stood inside it at midday with the door shut and no light but what came through the crack, and it was cool as a root cellar, and dry as a bone and dead silent, and the smell of the tarred oak was sharp and clean around her, and she thought, this will hold whatever comes. For a spell that autumn things ran quiet and steady on the Colvard place. She had a shelter that had learned its lesson and passed its retest, a father who had said his piece and gone back to his wheat, and a name in town that had softened from lunacy into mere eccentricity, the timber woman who dug herself a hole and, against all sense, finished it. She priced no work because no work had come, and she did not go looking for it because she was not yet a builder of anything. She was a woman who had built one thing for her own family and meant to see it stand a while before she said a word about it to anybody. That quiet did not last, and the thing that ended it came up out of the southwest on an afternoon, the following June, on air that had gone wrong in a way anyone raised on that ground could feel in their teeth. The barometer in the kitchen window had dropped so fast that Amos tapped the glass twice with a knuckle, thinking the thing had come loose in its case. It had not. Outside, the yard lamp on its pole began to swing in slow circles, though there was hardly a breath of wind yet, throwing shadows that walked across the gravel and walked back, and the air over the wheat had gone a flat, sick green-yellow that anybody in Tolliver County reads on sight and reads only one way, which is get low and stay low. Adaline was already moving before the first real gust came, out the door with the sleeves of her work shirt shoved up and her hair tied back low, driving 11 head of the gentlest cows down toward the shelter mouth, her father behind her with the brass rule still in his breast pocket because he owned no shirt he wore without it. The wind found its voice while they worked, took Amos's words clean off his mouth so that he gave up talking and only pointed, and the first fat drops came sideways and stung. They were not the only ones who had read the sky. Down the section road at a hard trot came Emery Tate's flatbed, the old team lathered and wild-eyed, and beside Emery on the seat sat his married daughter, Sarah Wick, who lived on the next quarter, with her two small children pressed between the grown bodies, and behind them in the bed rode the two Renner girls from the place beyond, holding to the sideboards, their father already gone ahead on horseback to turn his stock loose from a barn he did not trust to stand. Emery had seen the same green light Adaline had seen, and he had done the arithmetic every farmer in that country carried in his blood, which was that his own soddy roof would not answer for what was coming, and that the only hole in the ground for 3 miles that anyone had bragged on or laughed at belonged to the timber woman. He hauled the team to a sliding stop in the Colvard yard, and there was no time for a word about any of it, no time for pride on either side. Get them down, Adaline told him, one hand already on the shoulder of the smaller Wick child. And there was nothing in her voice but the flat certainty of a person who knows exactly where the safe place is because she built it. Sarah Wick gathered her little ones and went down the stone steps into the dark with the practiced quickness of a mother who does not waste a second arguing with weather. And the Renner girls followed close, and Emery came last, after he'd tied the team's lines, to a post they would tear loose from soon enough, but that would hold them the length of a running knot. Down in the shelter, the lantern from the back shelf came alive under Sarah's hand, and it laid a small, steady circle of light on the gathered faces, and the youngest Wick child, a boy not 4 years old, pressed his face into his mother's skirt, and she smoothed his hair and told him, low and even, that the roaring outside was only a big wind, and that this little house under the ground was the strongest place in the whole county, and the boy believed her, because a mother's voice in the dark is a wall of its own. Adaline pulled the heavy door shut against its stop and dropped the bar, and the wet, howling world outside went to a muffled, distant thing. And inside, there was lamplight and cattle breathing, and the smell of tarred oak and turned earth. What came across Tolliver County that afternoon was not a narrow, twisting funnel that skips and lifts and sets down a mile on. It was a straight-line wind, a great flat downburst that laid itself across 18 miles of open ground, the way a hand comes down flat on a tablecloth and drags everything toward the edge. There was a settler's wind gauge on a pole at the edge of Courland, a cup anemometer a retired railroad man kept for his own amusement, and it registered a peak gust of 106 miles an hour before the cups tore off the spindle and went wherever the rest of the loose things in the county went that day. 106. That is a hurricane's wind in a place that has no ocean to blame it on. Inside, under 9 by 11 oak, stacked and pinned and buried in gravel and rock, and keyed 9 feet back into an unbroken bank, Adaline sat on the plank bench with her back against the east wall, the very wall that had bowed and taught her, and she put her hand flat against the timber behind her, and the wall did not move. Not a shudder. Not the long groan a pole barn makes when the pull begins to work its nails. There was noise, an ocean of it, a freight train roar that came up out of the southwest and did not stop, and the sound of something metal skidding across the yard overhead for a long, long time, and the door shivered once against its bar as the pressure changed, and the youngest Wick child startled at that, and his mother drew him in closer and did not let the fear reach her own voice. "It's only the wind knocking to see if we're home," she told him, and the older children even managed a small startled laugh at that, and the boy quieted. The noise was all outside. The mast they were leaning on weighed better than 40,000 pounds of timber and rock and earth, pinned to the hill with half-inch iron, driven better than 2 feet into the ground, and the wind had no idea in the world what to do with it. Adaline looked at the white-marked pins along the wall by the lantern light, and none of them had moved, and she understood in a way she had not fully understood before that she had built the thing right, that the bow had been the making of it, that the wall which had once tried to fall on her was now the reason every soul crowded on to that plank bench was going to walk back up those steps into the daylight. The pressure came against the wall the way the water had, only faster and drier, 30 pounds to the square foot of push against the exposed face, which came to some 9,000 pounds of wind laid flat on a wall that weighed 40,000 and was tied to the earth besides. It was never a contest. The wind was a strong man, throwing his shoulder against a mountain and calling it a fight. Somewhere in the worst of it, when the roar was at its highest and the door was straining hardest against the bar, Amos Colvard, who had not said a word since the wind took his voice in the yard, leaned over to his daughter in the lamplight and put his mouth near her ear so she could hear him over the din. "You built us a hill," he told her, and there was a thing in his face she had not seen turn toward her work before, which was not pride exactly, because pride was a thing Amos distrusted, but something quieter and harder to earn, which was trust. She did not answer him. She only kept her hand flat on the cold sound timber and waited the wind out with the certainty of a woman who has already tested the thing that is now being tested for real. It ran perhaps 12 minutes, though inside the ground with the roar going, it might have been an hour or a breath, and then the roar began to pull away northeast the way weather does, dragging its noise behind it, and the drumming on the earth roof thinned, and the door stopped straining, and a strange ringing quiet came down over everything. Adaline waited a full count past the last of it, because the calm behind a wind can pull a person out too early into a second slap, and only when she was sure did she lift the bar and put her shoulder to the door and push it up and out against a weight of hail and torn branch that had piled against it. Gray wet light came down the stone steps. She climbed out first into a world that did not look like the one she'd left. Daylight came up over a yard, rearranged by something, without any thought behind it. Half the tin was gone off the equipment shed, peeled back and folded like paper. A section of west fence was flat, the posts snapped off at the ground line, where the wood had done all the work, until it could do no more. Emery Tate's team stood shivering and unhurt at the end of the tie post that had, in fact, held. Away northeast, the roofs were off 2 barns, and Frank Devers's pole barn, 3/4 of a mile up the section road, was simply gone. Gone in the way a house of cards is gone when a hand sweeps across the table. The laminated posts snapped off 8 inches above the ground, where the iron fasteners had been doing the whole of the work, and had finally quit all at once. A grain bin stood in the middle of a wheat field, a 1/4 mile from where it belonged, dented but whole, dropped there gently by a wind that had smashed everything around it, the way a cyclone will spare one china cup on a shelf and take the house. Down the road, Lloyd Renner came riding back at a gallop through the thinning rain, having turned his stock out ahead of the wind, and when he saw his 2 girls standing whole In the Colvard yard, he came off that horse before it had fully stopped and gathered them in without a word. And the older girl told him, with the offhand cruelty of a child who has already stopped being afraid, that they had waited it out in a bear's den and he had missed it. The families came up the steps into the wet, ruined light, and Sarah Wick carried her youngest on her hip and set him down on the one patch of gravel the storm had left swept clean, and the boy, who a quarter hour before had pressed his face into her skirt in the dark, now looked around at the flattened fence and the folded tin with the frank, bright interest of a child to whom the whole world is a show put on for him. And he asked his mother whether they might come back and sit in the little underground house again sometime. Sarah Wick laughed with tears standing in her eyes and told him yes. Whenever the wind came knocking, they would always have a den to go to. Lloyd Renner stood with a daughter under each arm and looked at the mounded earth over the shelter that had not lost so much as a shovelful, and then at his own distant roofless barn. And he took his hat off, not in grief, because everyone he loved was standing whole in that yard, but in something he did not have another gesture for. Adaline did not stand and look at the wreckage long, because looking at wreckage changes nothing about it. She went along her own structures with the brown book out of her pocket and her father's brass rule in her hand, and she checked every pin, every single white-painted head, setting the rule against the marks, one at a time, down the whole run of every wall, and not one of them had backed out an eighth of an inch. She wrote the date at the head of a clean page. She wrote 106 under it, the number the retired railroad man's gauge had given up before it tore loose, which she would have from him himself within the week. She closed the book and put it back in her pocket and stood a moment in the swept clean yard with the smell of the past storm still hanging wet and green in the air. And Amos came and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything, because the thing that needed saying had been said down in the dark with his mouth near her ear, and some things you do not improve by saying twice. News of that afternoon moved kitchen to kitchen the way a grass fire moves with the wind behind it, and it did not need a road. By the following Thursday, the story had passed across every counter in the county, and it had a shape to it now that was not the old shape, not the timber woman with her hole in the ground, but something with a number stuck to it. 106 miles an hour, they were saying, and under all of it, without so much as a shudder, 2 families' children and 3 grown people had ridden it out dry in a cellar a woman had built out of railroad wood the railroad had paid to burn for a sum of money a man could carry loose in his pocket. Where the old story had made people laugh, the new one made them go quiet and think. And thinking, in a farming county, is the thing that comes right before a man knocks on your door with his hat already in his hands. Frank Devers came first, which surprised nobody who knew him and shamed him not at all, because a man who has just watched his new barn scattered across a wheat field has had the argument settled for him by the weather and does not need to be talked into anything. He came up the Colvard Drive on foot on the Saturday after the storm, his cap already off and turning in his 2 hands, and he stood in the yard, looking a long while at the mounded earth and the plank door and the walls of the shed stored the storm had opened up so a person could see the crossed courses inside. The same walls he had laughed about at a cattle sale that spring in front of a dozen men. He did not bring the laughing up, and neither did she, because there is no profit in a man's shame once he has come to your door. And the coin she wanted from Frank Devers was not an apology. "What would you charge?" he asked her finally, not able to look straight at her yet, looking instead at the door as though the door had done the thing and not the woman. "To put one of these in for me." And Adaline Colvard, who had never in her life been asked by anyone to build a single thing, took the brown book out of her breast pocket and turned to a clean page. And she did not answer him right away, because she was already doing the arithmetic, already seeing his slope and his soil and the run of his ground in her mind, already a builder and not yet knowing that she was. She quoted Frank Devers' 31 feet of retaining work along the cut behind his house, tied into a shelter 9 by 12 on the inside, materials and hauling included, $38, half down and the balance on completion, the whole agreement fitting on the single leaf she tore from the brown book and set in his hand. He read it twice, standing there in the swept yard, with his cap still in his other fist, and then he asked her where he was to take it to be looked over. meaning by a man, cease, meaning by somebody at the bank or the lumberyard who would tell him whether a woman's figures could be trusted. She let that sit a moment before she answered him. You can take it anywhere you like, she said, but the wall you're standing next to already passed the only inspection that matters, and it didn't charge you for the visit. Devers looked over at the mounded earth that had held while his own new barn went across a wheat field in pieces, and something in his shoulders came down, and he reached into his coat for the fold of money he had brought out in hope rather than certainty, and he counted $19 into her black-stained palm right there in the yard. That was the first money that ever came onto the Colvard place because of a stack of wood a railroad had paid to be rid of, and she did not close her hand on it the way a person closes a hand on something won. She folded it once and put it in the tin box behind the flour that evening on top of the 410 that had never once been touched, and she wrote the sum in the brown book under a fresh heading she had not had cause to write before, which was simply the word earned. Frank Devers's wall went up in 9 days on the cut behind his house, and Adaline built it a shade different from her own, because his ground was sandier and his slope shorter, and she had learned by then that no two holes in the earth are the same hole. She battered the face of it back into the hill an inch for every foot it rose, so that the mass of the wall and the mass of the dirt behind it leaned into one another and made a single wedge instead of a shoving match, and she understood as she set the courses that a plumb wall is a lever the earth is handed to push on, while a wall laid back into the slope is a weight the earth has to lift before it can move it at all. And the earth is strong, but it is lazy, and it will not lift what it can lean on. Devers watched her drive the dead men back into his bank and pin them through, and he asked her once why she did not simply build it straight up like a proper wall, and she set the tip of the auger to the timber and leaned into it before she answered. Because straight up is what looks right to a man, she told him over the bite of the bit, and laid back is what stays right to the hill, and I'd rather be right to the hill. By the time she pulled her tools off the Devers place, the second job was already waiting, and she had not gone looking for it. A woman named Dessa Harknett, who ran 90 head of cattle on grass east of Courland and had buried a husband, churchback, and run the place herself since, drove into the Colvard yard behind a good bay horse and did not ask what a shelter cost. She asked how soon Adaline could start, which is a different question entirely, and it is the question of a person who has already decided. Dessa Harknett had lost a windmill tower and a hired man's shanty to the same downburst that flattened Devers, and she had stood in her own root hole through the worst of it with the dirt close around her face, and she had come out of that hole resolved never to spend another storm that way. I don't care what it looks like from the road, she said, sitting her horse in the yard without dismounting. I care what it feels like from the inside with the wind on. Adaline liked her at once, the way you like a person who has already done your arguing for you. And she took the Harknett job for the winter and built it deep and dry. And when it was finished, Dessa Harknett walked down into it, shut the door, stood a long minute in the dark and the tar smell and the silence, and came back up the steps and paid her in full and in cash and told 2 churches worth of women about it before the month was out. 3 more jobs came in over the next 14 months, all of them within a day's wagon haul, all of them cash or a check written on completion. And Adaline did the arithmetic on each one in the brown book the way her father did it, in pencil and slowly, refusing to spend a dollar she had not yet earned. She learned the county's ground, one hole at a time, the sand east of town and the heavy gumbo south of it, and the shallow rock that lay 2 feet down along the ridges, and she learned that a builder is only as good as her willingness to change the drawing when the dirt disagrees with it. In the fall of the second year, she bought a heavier wagon and a second span of mules at an estate sale near the county line for $110, paid in full out of the tin box, and drove them home at a walk in the long light with the money gone and no note signed for any of it. That detail is going to matter more than anything else in this whole account, so it is worth stopping on a moment. She did not borrow a single dollar to grow the thing. Not from the bank in Courland, not from Cyrus Pelham's counter, not even out of her father's tin which she had promised to leave alone and had left alone. Every wagon, every span, every keg of iron came out of money The work itself had already made, and so the work owed nothing to anyone, and a thing that owes nothing cannot be called in. There was one man in Tolliver County who had not come around, and everyone knew exactly who he was. And everyone was waiting on it the way you wait on the other boot to drop. It came on a still afternoon in the second summer when a good buggy behind a matched team turned in off the section road alone and stopped in the Colvard yard. And Cyrus Pelham climbed down out of it in his town clothes, his white shirt and his dark vest, his spectacles pushed up on his nose, and he did not lean on anything, because there was nothing in that yard built for a man to lean on, and nothing in his own bearing that day that wanted to. He stood on the swept gravel, and he looked a long, long while at the walls of the first shelter, at the crossed black courses and the mounded earth and the white-painted pinheads marching in their true lines. The very work he had told a store full of paying customers was a woodpile with a roof that a woman would be digging back out of the ground inside 4 years. His ears had gone red above his collar, which was a thing Adaline had never once seen happen to Cyrus Pelham behind his counter. And he took his hat off, and he said the thing he had driven 11 miles alone to say, and he did not dress it up. "I was wrong," he told her. 3 words. That was the whole of it, and it cost him more to say than the wall had cost her to build, and both of them knew it, and neither of them made it worse by adding anything. 3 words do not mend a reputation, but they travel, and Cyrus Pelham's 3 words farther than his laugh ever had. He drove out of the yard that afternoon and told exactly one man at his counter what he had seen, and then, without any announcement and without ever once being asked, he began to send her work. A name written on the back of a receipt and slid across the counter to a farmer asking where a body might get a cellar dug that would actually hold. A quiet word to a widow that the Colvard woman built them dry and built them cheap and did not need a man to check her figures. He did it for years, and he never made a speech about it, and he never sent word that he was doing it, and Adaline learned of it only slowly, one customer at a time, mentioning that Pelham at the hardware had pointed them out the section road. A man who has been wrong out loud does not usually announce that he has changed. He simply starts doing the right thing quietly and lets you catch him at it. And that is worth more than any apology said across the store counter, because it is paid in deeds after the words are long spent. For a spell after that, the thing ran smooth. 3 or 4 jobs a season, her father keeping a ledger nobody had asked him to keep, the tin box growing heavier behind the flour. That smooth spell broke, not on account of anything Adaline did wrong, but on account of what began happening to everyone around her who had done, by the lights of the day, everything right. The trouble came up slow out of the ground itself, the way the water had come up behind her wall, patient and even, and giving no warning until the bow was already in the timber. In the years she had been quietly building shelters, land in Tolliver County had been climbing in price faster than any man could farm it, and the bank in Corland had been writing notes against that climbing ground as though the climb would never stop, as though a paper price were the same thing as a wheat crop. Pleasant men in clean shirts told careful farmers who had never owed a dollar in their lives that not borrowing was leaving money lying in the field, that a man who did not expand was a man falling behind, that the ground under his boots was worth 3 times what he'd paid, and he ought to spend some of that worth before somebody else did. And the careful men, some of them, believed it, because it is a hard thing to keep your head when every voice you respect is telling you that caution is a kind of cowardice. Lloyd Renner believed it. He had rebuilt his storm-torn barn the season after the downburst, and then, with the ground under him appraised at a number that made him feel rich, he had gone into the bank and borrowed against it a new frame barn, a riding cultivator, a team of blooded horses, all of it financed against a paper value that existed only so long as everyone agreed to believe in it. He was not lazy, and he was not a fool. He was a good farmer who had been told by the people whose business it was to know that the safe road was the timid one, and he had listened. His daughters had ridden out the great wind in Adaline's shelter and come up those stone steps into the daylight whole and unafraid, and now their father had put the family's whole future onto a signature at a desk in Corland, and the difference between those 2 kinds of shelter The one built out of proven wood for $18, and the one built out of borrowed optimism against a lien on the ground, was about to become the only thing that mattered in the county. Adaline saw it before most because she read numbers the way other people read weather, and because she stood outside the thing entirely and could watch it plain. She said as much to her father one evening at the supper table, watching him rule his columns with the brass edge. "They're borrowing against a price," she told him, "not against a crop, and a price is only what the last fool paid, while a crop is what the ground actually gives you." Amos looked up over the small spectacles and worked that over and set his pencil down. Then, "God help the man who mistook the one for the other," he said, and went back to his figures. And neither of them yet knew how many men in Tolliver County had made exactly that mistake, or how fast the ground was about to remind them of the difference. The reminder came in the form of drought and a broken price, the two of them arriving together the way trouble likes to. The rains that had once come too hard behind her wall now did not come at all. A dry summer laid over open ground that cracked and paled, and the wheat that did make a head made a poor one. And the price that wheat brought at the Corland elevator fell by half as the same drought that thinned crop across 1,000 miles of the same flat country and glutted every market at once with the little there was. The paper price of land, which had only ever been a story the county told itself, stopped being told. Ground that had been appraised at a number to justify a loan was suddenly worth only what a buyer would pay for it, and no buyer would pay much for cracked dirt in a dry year. And the notes, written against the high number, came due against the low one. A man who had borrowed $1,000 against ground the bank now valued at 400 still owed the thousand, and the bank, pleasant no longer, wanted its money or wanted the ground, and it did not much care which. Verlin Prather, 4 miles east, whose new machine shed still had the bright unweathered look of fresh lumber, went into the bank in the spring to renew his note and came out having agreed to a payment larger than his entire previous year's clear profit. He sold his blooded team in April to make one installment. The shed followed the ground before the year was out, both of them gone to the bank, and Verlin Prather, who had farmed carefully for 30 years, before a clean-shirted man talked him into a single incautious season, moved his family into a rented place across the county and did not speak of it. His was the first, and it was not the last. And through that whole hard reckoning, the Colvard place stood outside it entirely and untouched because it owed no one anything, because its builder had bought nothing she could not pay for the day she bought it. Hard interest cannot touch a thing that was never financed. It could only touch everyone standing around her, and by the second year of the dry, it was touching nearly all of them. The Renner place went under in the March of the third dry year. Adaline came around a bend in the section road with a wagon load of iron and saw the auction bill already tacked to a fence post at the county road. Yellow cardstock, black letters, a date and a time, and the two words that meant a family's whole working life would be sold off in an afternoon to the highest hand raised, absolute, no reserve. She reined the mules to a stop and sat there a moment in the seat looking at the bill. And she did not feel any of the grim satisfaction a smaller person might have felt at being proved right, because there was nothing to be right about, only a good farmer caught in a trap that had been baited with his own good ground. Lloyd Renner was not lazy, and he was not stupid, she thought, sitting there. He was only exposed, and I was not, and the whole difference between us is a signature I never put my hand to. That was the truth of it, and it was a colder truth than any she had written in the brown book, because it meant that the thing that had saved her was not chiefly her cleverness, or her reading, or her hard hands, though it was those too, but the plain refusal to owe, a refusal that had looked to the whole county like poverty and timidity. Right up until the season, it looked like the only sense anyone in Tolliver County had shown in 10 years. She went to the Renner auction because a person ought to stand up in the daylight at a neighbor's hard hour and not hide from it, and she stood at the back of the gathered crowd in her canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow, her hands still at her sides, while a fast-talking auctioneer up on a hay wagon sold a man's plows and his blooded horses and his new cultivator for a fraction of what the borrowing against them had cost. Lloyd Renner stood off to the side with his wife and his two girls. The same girls who had ridden out the great wind hole in her shelter. And the girls did not understand the whole of what was happening, only that the neighbors were leading off the horses. And their mother kept them close and kept her chin up and told them they were going to a new place, with a good creek and a school nearer than this one. And the girls, being children, took the promise of a creek and a nearer school at its face, and were, in the plain mercy that is given to the young, more curious than afraid. Adaline bid on exactly two things that day. A coffee can of assorted bolts, mostly half-inch by 6, which came to her for a dime because no one else wanted a can of rusty iron, and a water-stained book she spotted on a table of household odds, a timber engineer's handbook of an older edition than her own borrowed one, which cost her a quarter and which she carried to the wagon under her arm, like the only thing worth having in the whole sad yard. She used the bolts. She used the book harder. That night at the kitchen table, while her father read the auction bill through his spectacles without a word of comment, she went through the older handbook page by page and found in the back of it a set of tables she had never seen. In the pocketbook she had been copying from, for years, sheer connection values, the strength of iron fannings loaded across the grain instead of along it, exactly the numbers that governed the dead men she had been driving back into every bank by instinct and rough rule. She copied 4 pages of them into the brown book by lamplight in her small square hand, and she understood as she copied that a good man's whole ruin had put into her hands. For a quarter, the very knowledge that would make the next 100 walls she built stronger than the last. And there was no way to be glad of that, and no way to refuse it either. And the only honest thing to do with the gift that came at another's cost was to use it well enough to be worth what it had cost him. Supply became the next problem, and it was a good problem, the kind a person only earns by succeeding. 100 bridge timbers had sounded like an ocean the June she hauled them home. But she had spent 31 of them behind Frank Devers's house alone, and more behind Dessa Harknett's, and the yard stack that had once looked like a woman's lunacy was down by half before the third dry year was out. So she did the thing that had started the whole business in the first place. Only now, she did it on purpose and in writing. She wrote letters to the division offices of every rail line within 100 miles, on ruled paper in her plain hand, asking after pulled timber and condemned trestle stock, and any structural oak the roads were paying to dispose of, and in the spring 2 answers came back. A line abandonment north of Dunmore had bridge timbers coming out, heavy stuff, 12 by 14 section, 16 feet long, 31 of them, oak, and a yard cleanup at a division point had switch ties, the long ones, 10 and 11 and 12 feet, near 200 of them stacked and in somebody's way. Both piles were slated for the burn stack, same as her first 100 had been. She paid $9 for the bridge timbers and 6 for the switch ties, and both roads thanked her for hauling the trash off their property, and she drove home behind 2 spans of mules with more proven oak than she had started her whole enterprise with, bought for the price of a Sunday hat. By then she built the way a person builds who has failed once and never means to fail the same way twice, and every hard lesson had a piece of iron or a course of rock to show for it. The batter came first on every wall now, the lean back into the hill that fought the earth into a compression joint instead of a shoving match. Then the cap plates, flat steel she salvaged off, broken cultivator frames, and cut to length and set across the top's course wherever a joint in the top row fell over a joint in the one beneath, so that no single timber could ever walk out under a freeze-and-thaw cycle without dragging steel and 2 neighbors along with it. The through bolting, and here was the part that Cyrus Pelham himself eventually asked her about twice, standing in her yard with a genuine question in place of the old contempt. Above the third course, she had stopped trusting driven pins as her main fastening and gone to half-inch bolt, run clean through both timbers, a washer and a nut on the outside face, snugged down hand-tight, and then given a quarter turn with a wrench. It was not pretty. A person could stand in the yard and count every nut on the wall. That was precisely the point, and it was the whole of her creed as a builder, though she never called it a creed. She would not use a fastening she could not inspect. Anything buried, anything hidden inside the timber, where damp and iron and 40 winters of frost could work on it in secret, was a fastening that could fail without ever telling anybody, and a thing that fails in secret is a thing that fails when the family is inside. Every joint in every wall she built was meant to be readable by a person standing on the ground with a lantern, so that she could walk a 5-year-old wall in 11 minutes and know exactly what it was doing and exactly what it was not. Amos kept the ledger through all of it, a thick green cloth account book. He had started the week the rebuilt wall first read true, and nobody had asked him to start it, and he had never once explained why he did. He ruled his own columns with the brass folding rule out of his breast pocket, and he entered every job in his slow blocked capitals, the jobs and the gross, and the materials, and the fuel, and the net running down the right-hand side in a hand that grew no less careful as he grew older. He was past 70 now, slower on the walk out to the shelter pits, needing to stop once on the rise to catch his breath, but no slower with the rule, which he still snapped open to check a wall his daughter had built, snapping it shut again without a word, which was his whole review and always had been. He said his true piece exactly once, on a warm evening on the tailgate of the wagon, watching a two-man crew she had taken on set a header across a shelter mouth. "You were right," he told her. 3 words of his own, no more ceremony to them than Pelham's had carried, and it cost him nothing to say, because he had only ever been waiting for the ground to answer the question, and the ground had answered it, and a fact once proven did not embarrass Amos Colvard to admit. The dry broke in the 5th year, the way a drought always eventually breaks, and the country that had emptied of its most leveraged farmers slowly filled again with cautious ones, and the demand for what Adaline built did not fall off with the return of the rain, but climbed, because every family that had run to a neighbor's root hole through the dry year's spring storms had come out of it, resolved to have a real hole of their own. She took on a hired man that year, a steady fellow named Del Poteet, who could run a cross-cut straight and did not talk when there was nothing to say. And the year after that, a second crew, because she had stopped being a woman who built storm shelters and become the person in 4 counties who built them. She never bought a stick of new structural timber in any of those years. Not one, because the roads kept pulling old oak and kept paying to be rid of it, and she kept writing her plain letters and kept hauling it home, and the whole enterprise ran on wood the country had thrown away, and a knowledge she had gathered off, borrowed pages, and a ruined neighbor's quarter book, and her own 2 failing, then holding walls. The outside world found her in the spring the rains fully returned. A trade paper printed in Kansas City, a monthly for farmers with a page or 2 on building and improvement, ran a short piece on timber shelter and retaining work being done down in the southwest counties, and the writer got a fact or 2 wrong, the way writers do, but got one thing exactly right, which was the cost of enclosed space measured against the cost of the stone and lime cellars the masons were still quoting. Not long after the piece ran, a letter came to the Cortland post office addressed to the timber builder, no name, and the postmaster knew well enough who that was and set it aside for her. And it was from the Agricultural Society that ran the Farmers Institute at Dunmore, inviting her to come speak for a session on low-cost farmstead building. She answered it in one line on ruled paper, saying she would come, and she went, and she stood in a hall full of men under the hiss of the wall lamps. The only woman, in the room near 160 faces turned up at her, and she talked for the better part of an hour about how deep the tar drove into oak, and why a 9 by 11 timber laid on its flat carried a wholly different way than the same timber stood on its edge, about crown side up and iron on 2-foot centers and where the water goes. She never once mentioned Cyrus Pelham, or the laugh he had laughed at her over a keg of nails, or the 4 years he had generously allowed her before her failure. She had no need to. The men in that hall were writing her figures down in their own notebooks, and that was a better answer than any score she could have settled from a platform. She came home from Dunmore on a Sunday to find her father out at the first shelter, in the low gold light, the brass rule open against the east wall, checking a wall he had checked 100 times and did not need to check again, running the rule down the line of white-painted pins that had not moved a hair in years. Still true, he told her when he heard the wagon, not turning from the wall, and she did not answer, because she had known. It was still true since the second rain proved it, and because there are some things a person says not to inform you, but only to have the saying of them. And this was her father, past 70, standing in the evening light with his hand on a wall his daughter had built out of railroad trash, telling the wall and the dusk and himself that it was still true, and she let him have the saying of it and did not spoil it with a word. The years ran on after that the way good years do, quietly and quickly. The numbers in the green ledger grew until the first volume swelled at its spine and had to be rubber banded shut, and a second one started. The yard stack of proven oak rose and fell and rose again as the roads kept feeding her the country's cast-off timber, and she kept turning it into ground a family could climb down into when the sky came apart. She bought a third wagon, then a fourth span, all cash, all out of money the work had made, and she never signed a note for any of it. Cyrus Pelham kept quietly sending her the names of men who needed what she built right up until the last years he stood behind his counter, and when at last he sold the store and moved in with a married son 2 counties over, the man who bought the hardware kept up the habit without ever fully knowing where it had started, so that the section road out to the Colvard place stayed worn by wagons, for reasons the new owner could not have named. Her father used the first shelter one final time, in the spring of 1902, 91 years old, and no, Amos Colvard was born. The year, the county was barely a county, and in the spring of 1902 he was past 80 and moving like a slow tide. And a black wall came up out of the southwest one last time in his life, and he went down the 6 stone steps he had watched his daughter cut. And he sat on the plank bench with his back to the east wall, and when the wind had passed, he came up into the light and knocked the top of that wall twice with his knuckles and said nothing at all, which from him was a standing ovation. He lived another year past that. When he went in his sleep, in the winter, 83 years old, and the brass folding rule was in the breast pocket of the shirt he was laid out in, until Adaline, at the last moment, took it back out and kept it, because a rule is a working tool, and a working tool belongs in a hand, not in the ground. The green ledgers, 3 volumes deep by then, she set on the shelf above the shop bench and did not open, because the figures in them were his handwriting, and she did not need to read the numbers to hear him saying them. For a while after that, things ran quiet. A 2-man crew, a wagon that started, more work than a woman past 60 had any business taking on, and taking it on anyway. That quiet did not last, and the thing that ended it drove into the Colvard yard on a Thursday afternoon in the fall of 1913, a young woman in a plain traveling coat, who climbed down stiff from a long ride and stood a moment getting her bearings, a black, hardbound notebook held against her ribs like something she was afraid to set down. Junia Marsh was Adeline's late sister's girl, 23 years old, light brown hair tucked behind one ear, gray eyes, the same scatter of freckles across the nose that ran in that family like a signature written down the generations. She had spent 2 years clerking and keeping figures for a bridge and culvert contractor up on the Platte, and she sat down at the kitchen table before anyone thought to offer her a chair, opened the notebook, and turned it around so it faced her aunt. "Old rail," she said, and her voice had a small shake in it that had nothing to do with the cold. "Worn rail and pulled iron bridge stringers, coming out by the mile as the roads relay with heavier steel. The companies are paying teamsters to haul it to the scrap dealers, and the scrap dealers are paying next to nothing for it because there's a glut of it 1,000 miles wide." She had sketched a creek crossing on one page and a stockshade frame on the next, and a culvert lining on the third, and her hand had gone unsteady on the last of them, and the figures for the loads and the spans she had written small and crowded into the margins instead of out in the body of the page, which is what a person does with numbers. She is not yet sure she is allowed to be right about. Adaline read it twice. She looked at the load figures and the way the girl had crabbed the shear values into the margin, and she recognized the hand of it, not the penmanship, but the fear under it, because she had once filled a brown book exactly that way, in the margins, in the dark, 4 years before she let anyone see. She said yes that same afternoon. Not 3 days of walking a pasture at dusk, not one night of turning it over. She stood up from the table, said the one word, and reached across and turned the notebook back around to face the girl. And that was the whole of the deciding. And it told Junia Marsh more than any speech could have that the story her mother used to tell about Aunt Adaline and the railroad wood had been true in every particular. Then she took the girl out into the yard in the last of the orange light, and she showed her the thing she had never quite explained to anybody. Of the 100 bridge timbers she had hauled home in the summer of 1881, everyone was accounted for on a page near the front of the brown book, in a column she had kept for 32 years. So many gone into shelters that were still standing dry in 9 counties. So many split in the cutting or come out too checked to pin and gone to fence bracing. A handful burned in a grass fire one dry August. A dozen sold on, once to a man who wanted a garden wall, which was the only time she had ever sold raw material and which she had regretted inside a week. And 40 of them still stood in the yard where they had always stood, squared and banded and up on gravel and tarped. At the ends, the tar gone gray and the oak gone hard as horn. 32 years cured and never once used. Junia ran her hand along the top timber and asked why, in all that time, with all that work, her aunt had never spent them. Because somebody paid to be rid of these, Adaline said. I keep them so there's always a thing I can point at. She meant it plainly, the way she meant everything, but the girl understood the whole of it, that the 40 timbers were not lumber held in reserve, but proof held in the open. 40 pieces of evidence that a person could stand in that yard and lay a hand on, so that anyone who drove past on the section road, anyone who had ever laughed at a keg of nails or written a number on a receipt to prove a woman wrong, could see with their own eyes the thing the county had once been so sure was worthless. Standing sound after 3 decades in the weather, the light was going down orange across the wheat stubble, the same light that had been going down the first evening. She ate a cold supper, standing at the window over ground that had done what she asked. Adaline put her flat hand on the top timber of the stack and knocked it twice with her knuckles, the way her father had knocked the wall, the way she had watched an old man knock it one last time, before he climbed up into the light for good. Look at what had already survived, she said. Then she walked into the shop, and she opened the drawer of the bench, and she came back out with the brass folding rule, worn bright at the joints from 2 lifetimes of thumbs, and she put it into Junia Marsh's hand without any ceremony whatsoever, which is exactly how it had once been put into hers. The girl closed her fingers around it and did not say thank you, because some gifts are too large to thank a person for, and both of them knew it, and she stood there in the cooling yard, holding a dead man's rule and a living woman's trust, looking at 40 timbers that a railroad had once paid good money to burn. The real question was never whether a woman could build a storm cellar out of railroad wood for $18. The real question was why 100 sound pieces of proven oak were ever stacked in a weed lot waiting on a match in the first place, and how many piles just like them were sitting somewhere in the country that very evening, black with tar, hard as iron, already tested by 30 years of everything the sky could throw, waiting for somebody with the eyes to walk up and count them twice. Adaline Colvard had been that somebody once, a woman in a faded work shirt with her hands easy at her sides and a brown book in her pocket, and now she stood in the falling light and watched her sister's girl turn a brass rule over in her hands and begin, without quite knowing it yet, to be that somebody next. The 40 timbers stood black against the last of the sun. Nobody has ever taken them, and nobody ever will, because they were never lumber to begin with. They were the proof, and the proof is meant to stand where the road can see it.